Oh, Reverend Nikki and I have been watching Bill Moyer's interviews with Joseph Campbell on Netflix. They came out in 1988, right after my first son was born, so it's no wonder that I missed them because I was doing other things then, and I have more time now as an adult with sleep. Okay, anyway, we've been watching these series with Joseph Campbell, and I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, but his work can be synthesized by saying that the power of the story is so strong because we can identify with every part of the story, from looking at ourselves and finding ourselves in the story in our past, from looking at where we are now on our journey and being able to identify with the story that way, and holding on to that vision that things can get better and our lives can transform. That's how we interact with Joseph Campbell and his power of myth. He said that every religious tradition, every race, every culture, every nation, every tribe from the beginning of time has told stories all the way through the present. Now, with my Unity upbringing, I can meld with his ideas about story quite easily, because in Unity we use metaphysics as a lens to look at various stories. Most often in Unity we look at Bible stories, and we look at them metaphysically, which means that we are every aspect of the story. We are every character in the story, and everything that character or that aspect goes through is relevant because it brings it right up to current time. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke about a character named the prodigal son. And many of us can relate to the prodigal son because not once, but many times in our lives have we had an experience like the prodigal son. Hopefully, at a progressively evolutionary level. But time and time again, we find ourselves out in the wilderness. We find ourselves feeling a calling, like the son had a calling to be more than he was. And more than once, we asked for our inheritance. He asked for his inheritance and he received it. He had a calling, and I believe most of us do on a soul level, to love one another. And he had a calling to be in community and companion other people. And he had a calling for true belonging. We're in the middle of a multi-week series studying Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness book, and Brene Brown defines belonging this way. Belonging is the innate human desire to be a part of something larger than us. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and by seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. So this prodigal son asked for his inheritance, and he got it. Metaphysically, that inheritance represents our divine thinking or divine ideas. Each and every one of us has access to this divine thinking or divine ideas. It's our inheritance. They're the keys to the kingdom. They're the keys to transformation. So each and every one of us has at our fingertips and in our minds and our hearts creative thinking power. We have the capacity to manifest. We have the capacity to demonstrate. We have the capacity to use the spiritual practice that Unity calls the law of mind action. So this is a test. What is the law of mind action? Thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. What we think about, we bring about. So here the prodigal son had all the capacity of his divine inheritance. He had the law of mind action at his disposal, and he did what sometimes we do as human beings. Instead of reaching inward, instead of looking to the resources that he had within him, instead of authentically loving one another, instead of authentically companioning others in community, and instead of authentically finding true belonging, he looked outside of himself. He engaged in activities outside of himself, activities that he thought would help him fit in, activities he thought would get him approval, and activities that he thought would be more likable. In other words, he went down the road of degradation. In my 60 years of living, I have gone down the road of degradation more than once. Hopefully, in progressively evolutionary ways. But we can identify with the prodigal son because we have made choices that we find we wish we hadn't made. And the way we get out of those choices is by listening and leaning in to our own vulnerability. So when we engage in the unity practice, spiritual practice we call meditation, we listen to those whispers of guidance. And sometimes in life, when we find ourselves in crises, we listen to those whispers of guidance. And sometimes in life, when we're at the end of a chapter, or we've actually attained that great achievement, we begin to be open to listen to the whispers of guidance. In February of 1994, a woman named Colleen Seifert, PhD, woke up one Saturday morning and she ate her usual breakfast of half a bagel, fruit, and coffee. She took her dog, a Russian wolfhound named Bandit, out for a walk, and she came back home. Now, this is a woman who was an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, and for the last 6 years, every waking moment, other than Saturday mornings, had been working to attain and earn tenure. So she breathed her work, she slept her work, she lived her work. Everything was about getting tenure. She worked 7 days a week. She never slept more than 6 hours a night. But on this Saturday morning, she woke up and she said, I'm going to indulge in my usual Saturday morning indulgence. And she went out and ran errands. The first stop was just a couple blocks away from her home, and it was the dry cleaners. So because it was a beautiful sunny day in February, in Ann Arbor, and it was a holiday weekend, the streets were quiet and it was very pleasant, she decided to use the drive-thru. So she comes into Pittsfield Cleaners and she pulls into the drive-thru and she hands the man a tangled pile of clothes. And he was pulling them apart and sorting them, and he holds out this hot pink blouse and he says, is this a dress? And she says, no, it's a shirt. It's way too short. I would never wear a dress that short. And he looks at her and he says, if you've got it, flaunt it. Well, Seifert hadn't been on a date in over 2 years, and that was only because her colleagues pressed her so hard that she agreed to be fixed up. She was not in the practice of flirting, and she was certainly not used to noticing that a man was noticing her, and so she kind of hemmed and hawed, and when he asked her for her phone number, because he was writing out the ticket, she said, so what, are you going to call me for a date? She was flirting, and he was kind of confused, but he regained his composure, and he said, sure, of course. Well, she drove out of the dry cleaners, flushed with her daring, mind you. She really felt quite brave, but she also felt that that would never happen. But at 7 o'clock that night, it did happen. He called her up, he asked her for a date, and she said yes. They dated for 6 years until he proposed with an heirloom ring, and she said yes. Now, if I just stop the story here, you would be wondering how Seifert is like a prodigal son. Like, what bottom did she hit? How lonely did she get? What was the whole deal? How metaphysically was she identifying with the prodigal son? So I'll tell you the rest of the story. Okay. The day before she met Mr. Dry Cleaner Man, with the cute dimples and the blonde hair and the ponytail, the day before, she actually came home to herself. She was in her office alone when there was delivered this big bouquet of flowers, and it was from the chairman of the department. And the note with the flowers says, "Congratulations, you have earned tenure." And she looked around her empty office and she thought, if someone was here with me, I might hug them. But there was nobody there with her, and she began to cry. At first she told herself she was crying because she was so relieved. And then she recognized she was crying because she had no one in her life who was available or even identified to celebrate this achievement with her. So she asked a colleague out for a margarita after work, and after the first margarita, she called the evening short because she said, it feels anticlimactic, it just feels empty, I just don't know what to do, and she went home all by herself. So on that Saturday morning in February of 1994, Colleen Seifert, PhD, recognized that she was reaping the consequences that she had sown, and she decided to sow other seeds. She decided on a new goal, and her new goal was in 10 years, when she had a celebration, that she would be surrounded by friends and that she would be celebrated and they would laugh and they would do all kinds of things. So she set a new goal for herself before she even went to the dry cleaner. So already she was engaging in what Unity calls the law of mind action. She was applying it because she had this vision of what she wanted, and she was going to hold that vision. Now, she was a psychologist, and she had invented a term called predictive encoding. Doesn't that sound romantic? I'm going to practice some predictive encoding now. Well, really, it's about as romantic as saying, I'm going to now engage in the law of mind action. But really what she did was she created a vision for herself. Within 10 years' time, I'm going to be having celebrations, and I'm going to talk about what they feel like and what they look like. And I'm going to wonder what I'm going to be wearing, and I'm going to wonder what kind of car I'm going to be driving, and I'm going to wonder whether there will be flowers or whether there'll be balloons, and I'm going to wonder if people will be laughing at my silly jokes, and I'm going to be wondering if they're going to be laughing like they got tickled, or if they're going to be laughing like they're crying so hard because they're laughing and they're so full of joy. And at the end of the night, when the celebration is over, I'm going to be celebrating my tired but very sore feet from wearing my favorite high heels. So she began engaging in the law of mind action. She began to say, I want to truly belong. I want to truly and authentically love another person. I want to truly companion others in community. Brene Brown finishes her definition of belonging. She says this, because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. So, the prodigal son, when he came home to himself, he was working as a person who fed pigs. If you knew or know anything about Jewish culture, this is one of the most horrific engagements any person could have. Because not only do Jews not eat pork, but they don't raise pork, and they don't butcher pork, and they don't sell pork. And here he was with pigs. And moreover, he envied the pigs. He said, these pigs are eating better than I do. There's something wrong with this picture. And here I am, socially isolated, culturally isolated, and I don't want to go on this way any longer. Now, in the book, Brene Brown doesn't talk about the prodigal son at all. But she does say this. If you're anything like me and you find yourself questioning the idea that starvation and loneliness are equally life-threatening, Let me share the study that really brought all of this together for me. In a meta-analysis of studies on loneliness, researchers Julian Holt Lundstedt, Timothy B. Smith, and Bradley Layton found the following. Living with air pollution increases your odds of dying early by 5%. Living with obesity, 20%. Excessive drinking, 30%. And living with loneliness, it increases our odds of dying early by 45%. It is so important to tune in to that calling we have to love one another, to companion each other in community, and to authentically and truly belong. She goes on to say, we have to step out from behind the barricades of self-preservation and brave the wild. Brave the wild. The prodigal son was lonely. Colleen Seifert, PhD, was lonely. How many times or what part of our lives are we lonely in? And what will it take for us to brave the wilderness? It takes listening, and it takes a leaning in to our vulnerability. When we lean in, we trust each other. When we lean in, we trust ourselves, because the wilderness can be a very serious place, and it can be intense. Last week, Reverend Nikki talked about the braving checklist that Brene Brown gave for trusting others. And this week, I'm going to flip it over and look at the acronym she gives, braving, for trusting ourselves. And as a gift, we put it in the bulletin for you today. And if you are watching on YouTube or Facebook Live and you want your own personal copy, Mindy at unitywill.com, and I'll send you one, because you're worth it. Each and every one of us is worth coming home to ourselves. Being in the wilderness requires trust. B, boundaries. Am I respecting my own boundaries? Am I clear about what's okay and what's not okay? R, reliability. Am I showing myself to be reliable? Am I doing what I said I was going to do? A, accountability. Am I holding myself accountable? B, vault. Am I respecting the vault? The vault is that storehouse of information and experience that we've agreed to either keep private or share publicly. And in the vault, there are experiences that belong to other people that we don't share because they're not ours. And in the vault, we agree not to talk about other people when they're not present. So am I respecting the vault? I, integrity. Am I acting from my own integrity? Am I taking action based on my own values? Unity of Wilmington has core values: uplifting, spiritual, dynamic, loving. Are we as a community acting from those core values would be the broader picture. But on this one, where we're looking for self-trust, am I respecting and taking action based on my own values? My own values. Non-judgment. Have I been non-judgmental in asking for help? When my plate is full, as it frequently is, I can be non-judgmental and say, hey, would you get a volunteer in here to help with such and such? Or, hey, would you be willing to come in and help me with such and such? I'm not judging myself like, oh, if I were a better minister, I would be able to do all of these 120 hours of work in 1 week. No, I'm asking for help in a very non-judgmental way. Generous. Am I generous toward myself? Am I generous in nourishing my body? Am I generous in giving myself enough sleep? Am I generous in allowing time for exercise? Am I generous to my soul in engaging in meditation every day? It's an acronym, braving. But we all need support in the wilderness. And it takes courage to be in the wilderness. So if this is something that interests you, we have an affirmation. I am willing to brave the wilderness to come home to myself. I like that story. That we come home to ourselves, that we're courageous enough to be in the wilderness, to come home for ourselves. So if you're interested in making that affirmation and that commitment, say it with me, please. I am willing to brave the wilderness to come home to ourselves, to myself. We're going to sing about namaste, honoring the God in each other, first by recognizing that we have that God in ourselves. When we come home to ourselves first, then we're available to be present with other people. And we have some musicians somewhere that are going to support us as we begin to come home to ourselves. And it doesn't look like If you can tap dance, 42nd Street is having another set of auditions, I'm just saying. Okay, here comes. Or you can play the ukulele. Yeah, I can play the ukulele. Yeah. All of these are very powerful invitations, whether we're dancing as part of our predictive encoding, whether we're laughing or playing the ukulele as part of our applying the law of mind action. It truly begins when we come home to ourselves. The God in me beholds the God in you.
Loving attention to that place inside of you where you experience your oneness with God, and allow yourself to rest into that energy, to be present with yourself in your divine nature, breathing into it, allowing allowing it to radiate forth from you and fill every cell of your body. Allowing it to move past your edges. Filling up yourself with your own attention, the truth of you, your divine nature, the namaste that lives inside of each of us, allowing love to permeate. And imagining you loving your most authentic self, allowing that part of you to show up, to be vulnerable, to shine. For you truly do belong to yourself. And finding those ways of love, to embrace that belongingness, to embrace ourselves fully, freely, and joyfully. Imagining wrapping your arms around yourself, loving you, coming home to yourself, home in a way that supports you to live as fully as you as possible in any given moment. That supports you in braving the wilderness of our own souls, so that we can truly come into alignment with God, alignment with us, to live in harmony with each other, which always begins in self-acceptance and self-love. So we take these thoughts into the sacred and holy silence. Resting in this place of self-reflection, ask yourself, what in me needs to be loved? What in me can I embrace? Not try to get rid of. It's simply embrace. Allow love, the master healer and harmonizer, to do its work in me, its mighty work in me, so that I truly can come home to self-acceptance. Allowing that idea to simply bubble up. Holding yourself in love and in light and in knowing of your true value and worth. And breathing into that as we come back into this room, into this time, and into this place.